The ball is entirely in the court of our Western opponents, primarily the leaders of the Kyiv regime, and, in this case, first and foremost, their European sponsors.
Well, I think it tells us that what Putin has told us all along is what he still believes. He believes these are parts of Russia. He's prepared to, annex them by sham referendums and such like, and therefore claim they are part of Russia. And he will then demonstrate to the world that he thinks they are part of Russia. So it is entirely consistent with the way he's acted throughout this conflict, which is he makes his claims, he tries to back them up through pseudo-legal means, but of course they're not, because they're conducted under, vote gerrymandering processes. And as a result, he then tells us all this is the reality. So it's another, sleight of hand by Putin, and tells us exactly where he thinks he's going to end up and what he wants. And again, it's on all those who oppose the idea that you can just walk into another country and try and steal parts of it to oppose this and make sure that he doesn't get what he wants ultimately. And next year, that map will have to be smaller. The key to this is, how is he going to be pressured by the West to withdraw to a more sensible position that the Ukrainians can accept, which is, of course, the single most important determinant part of that, and which will then form the basis of a just peace. So what Putin tells us is simply his maximalist position. It's up to us to make sure that his maximalist position becomes a position the Ukrainians can be happy with, even if it's not an ideal situation for them, but one that they crucially feel will be able to form the basis of a stable peace that they can then rebuild their country to be part of the West. That's the goal that we should all be aspiring to do. And Putin can have his goals, but we should be focusing on our goals. Well, here's the big question. What exactly will Russia agree to when it comes to a peace deal? Right now, it seems that Putin is very locked on the idea that he should have all of the Donbass, and that there should be no Western troops at all or security guarantees. And as a result, he can decide to, dangle Ukraine's future ahead of it whenever he wishes. So there's no sense that he's willing to accept Western security guarantees as part of a Ukraine peace deal of any kind, whether that's a NATO guarantee or individual guarantees. And so the real question, which we put in very quickly by the Americans, is, will you accept these terms or not? And when he says no, or when he, sort of plays for time, which is his more likely response, then the response from the Americans in return should be, well, we're going to increase the pressure on you to, increase the likelihood that you will actually respond sensibly to a peace deal, because you claim you want peace, and actually sign a peace agreement. It depends on what the peace deal is. If it's a peace deal with security guarantees, credible security guarantees for Ukraine, then yes, you are going to see, I think, that acting as an impediment for him going forwards in other ways. But let's not forget, he doesn't necessarily have to attack Europe in conventional ways. We know full well that there have been, incidents of espionage. We know that the Russians have killed people on our soil. We know that, or try to. And we know that they are engaged in surveillance of our activities, trying to map out our defences, looking at undersea cables, and have in the past been engaged in cyber warfare and things like that. So even if you have security guarantees in Ukraine from a conventional way, and that will, perhaps act to stop him thinking he can go anywhere in Europe conventionally, there are other ways he could attack us. And there's no doubt that, regardless of what he says in terms of not viewing the West as an enemy, he does view the West as an enemy. He can't get away from that. That's in his own DNA, that the West is an enemy. Because if he didn't think the West was an enemy, he'd have no problem with NATO at any given moment. But he does have a problem with NATO because he thinks the West is an enemy. In reality, the West was not an enemy. The West would have perfectly happily, kind of dealt with him, I'm sure, until he showed, firstly, through domestic repression, that he was indeed intent on becoming a dictator within Russia, and secondly, of course, with his external aggression. So he is the author of his own misfortunes, but he would like to blame that all on the West. So the West correspondingly have to be very careful about his intentions in the future.
Well, stealing is not really correct definition for that. Stealing, this is when someone is doing it secretly, and they are doing it openly. This is a robbery. This is a robbery. Why they fail to do this? Why they fail to implement this robbery? Because the consequences can be really harsh for the robbers.
Well, that again remains unclear. As with everything Putin says, we're not quite sure what these, severe consequences might be. I mean, I suspect the obvious consequence, which is holding the Belgians back, is they fear a legal challenge. That's not a severe consequence in the great scheme of things, but that is why, of course, they are resisting this idea that Europe should take those frozen assets. But could he be hinting at more? It's entirely possible. The reality is that, when Putin in the past has spoken of such things, he's then followed up with military action. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that he's going to invade Europe if these assets are taken, but we can't, kind of get away from the idea that he wishes us ill, and therefore he will no doubt attempt to strike back in some way to make up for what he would see as a severe national loss of pride to lose this Russian state money. Well, it tells us that Putin will remain on the course he has been on for the last 3 years, 4 years almost. He has said he'll win this war one way or the other. Now, initially, of course, he thought he'd win it militarily. He thought he'd be in Kiev in 1 week and that would be it. The Ukrainians proved him wrong, and then the Europeans and Americans, rode in with the Ukrainians to stop that from happening. So, he hasn't given up his war objectives, so that much is clear. He still wants to, gain as much of Ukraine as possible. He'd like to collapse the Ukrainian government. Note, for example, that in his, kind of ramblings today, he was quite happy to support the idea of Ukrainian elections. Why? Because he wants to see a change of Ukrainian government, hopefully to something more palatable to him. But he knows that under the current Ukrainian leadership, they will resist him to their last, degree, to the utmost degree. So he will continue trying to get his objectives through the battlefield and hoping that Ukraine will collapse either economically or because the West withdraws military support, or he will hope to achieve some kind of victory through a peace deal that isn't really a peace deal, but turns out to be, a surrender deal for Ukraine. So the way to stop him, of course, is to make sure that Ukraine is resolute on the battlefield, is able to be supported, the Ukrainian economy is bolstered, and of course, in negotiations, if there is to be a peace deal, it's to be a fair peace deal, one where both sides will have to compromise, but that includes Mr. Putin. Well, this is a significant attack by the Ukrainians because, of course, it is in the Mediterranean. It's not in, if you like, the immediate vicinity in the Black Sea, where they have had quite a lot of success in terms of striking at Russian ships. And it's equally significant because, of course, it's a ship that's part of Russia's so-called shadow fleet. This is, of course, Russian assets being run under other flags, but really being run for the Russians, which has, of course, enabled the Russians to keep their economy going for some time. So it's a significant strike because it suggests to the Russians that their days of impunity, of breaking sanctions, running, sort of their convoys, could be over because the Ukrainians have suggested that they will, interdict them. And of course, that will be very bad news for the Russians because they've had to rely on this system, obviously, to transport equipment and keep the economy going. And if the Ukrainians now are able to extend this into other areas where the Russians have felt beforehand they had impunity, well then this is going to, I think, have some chilling effect on Russia's ability to conduct the war. So it's significant. It is only one ship at this point in time, but it's a statement of intent, I think, by the Ukrainians, and one the Russians should take very seriously.